The morning sun filtered weakly through the tall courthouse windows, its golden light unable to soften the heaviness that hung in the room. Dust motes floated in the shafts of light, swirling lazily above the polished wooden benches, where families and observers sat in uneasy silence. The walls, lined with oak panels, seemed to absorb every whisper and every shuffle, holding the room in a stillness that pressed down on everyone present. This was no ordinary court session. Everyone inside knew it. The case being heard today carried weight not only for the individuals involved, but for the entire community watching closely. The charges were serious, the details unsettling, and the outcome uncertain. It was the kind of case that brought reporters lingering outside, notepads ready, though none had been allowed into the chamber today. Inside, there was only the quiet thrum of anticipation, and it felt almost unbearable. At the very front, near the judge's bench, sat a figure who seemed strangely out of place, yet deeply significant. Max, a 6-year-old German Shepherd police dog. His thick, sable and cream fur caught the morning light, and his amber eyes scanned the room with calm vigilance. He didn't move much, only adjusted his position slightly to lay his paws more comfortably on the cool marble floor. Yet his presence radiated a kind of strength, silent, steady, and reassuring. Max had been trained as a service and comfort dog, particularly for children who were called to testify. He was not just a tool of the law, but a partner in courage, a living anchor for little ones who might otherwise crumble under the intimidating gaze of a courtroom. Today, Max's role would matter more than anyone could yet imagine. The attorneys at their tables shuffled papers quietly, whispering last-minute arguments and counterpoints to each other. Their voices were low, but the urgency in their tone revealed the stakes. On one side, the prosecution prepared to present their youngest witness, a toddler whose testimony could prove critical. On the other, the defense watched carefully, skeptical of what a child so young could possibly offer. Both sides knew that the case hinged on moments like this, fragile moments where truth had to fight its way through fear. The judge, a man in his late 60s with thinning white hair and lines etched deep into his face, sat quietly behind the bench, reviewing his notes. His gavel rested within reach, but he had no need to use it yet. He understood more than most that silence could be louder than any command. Over the years, he had presided over countless hearings, but this one weighed on him differently. A child's voice, uncertain, trembling, innocent, would soon be asked to bear the burden of truth. He knew the responsibility of protecting that voice fell on him as much as on anyone else in the room. Behind the benches, the audience shifted uncomfortably. Parents held their children close, some trying to distract little ones with quiet games on tablets or soft whispers. Others sat rigidly, hands clenched in their laps, eyes fixed forward. They weren't merely spectators. Many of them were connected to the case in ways that cut deep. Some were family of the accused. Others were friends or neighbors of those affected. A handful were advocates, people who fought daily to ensure that children in difficult circumstances found justice and safety. Every single person in that room carried their own layer of tension. The bailiff, standing near the side door, kept glancing toward the hallway beyond. That was where the young witness waited with her guardian. The child was not yet in the room, but her absence was almost louder than her presence could ever be. Everyone was aware that at any moment the door would open, and the atmosphere would shift again. For now, though, the silence was the only sound, broken occasionally by the faint rustle of a coat or the creak of a bench as someone shifted position. Max lifted his head suddenly, ears pricking forward. His attention went not to the people already inside, but toward that same side door, as if he could sense what lay beyond it. His handler, Officer Ramirez, followed his gaze and gave a faint smile. "He knows," Ramirez whispered under his breath, though no one answered him. The bond between handler and dog needed no explanation. Max always seemed to know when his presence was about to be called upon. The judge noticed the shift as well, his eyes flicking briefly to Max before returning to his notes. He cleared his throat, a small sound that nonetheless echoed across the room. It was a reminder that the session was about to begin in earnest. Lawyers straightened, families quieted, and the tension already thick drew tighter still. It wasn't fear of the courtroom itself that made the atmosphere so heavy. It was the knowledge that soon, a toddler barely old enough to form complete sentences would be asked to speak before strangers about things no child should have to remember. The thought alone pressed a lump into the throats of many present. Officer Ramirez leaned down slightly, resting a hand gently on Max's back. The dog remained still, though his tail gave a small, slow wag as if to reassure his partner. Max's steady breathing, his calm demeanor, seemed to ground those nearest to him. Even without words, he was already doing what he had been trained for, providing comfort, strength, and courage where it was needed most. Outside the door, faint footsteps echoed in the hallway. The sound was so soft that most of the audience didn't notice, but Max's ears twitched again. He turned his head toward the door and waited, as if already greeting the child he was meant to help. Inside, the silence deepened. The kind of silence that bends time, making every second stretch endlessly. People held their breath, waiting. Some prayed quietly. Others steeled themselves, bracing for whatever was about to unfold. The judge tapped his gavel once, not in reprimand, but to mark the official opening of this critical moment. His voice was calm, but firm as he said, "Bring in the witness." The words landed in the room like the strike of a bell. Every pair of eyes turned toward the door. The tension that had been building all morning coiled tight, ready to release. Max rose slowly from his position, stretching his front legs before sitting upright again. He didn't bark, didn't move toward the door. He simply waited, alert and ready, his steady gaze promising the kind of safety that no human words could match. And then, with a quiet creak, the door began to open. The moment before the child appeared was the heaviest of all. The entire courtroom seemed to balance on the edge of that single instant, the air thick with anticipation. Somewhere deep in the silence, hearts beat faster. Even those who had entered the room as skeptics or critics felt something unexplainable. They knew they were about to witness not just the proceedings of law, but a moment of raw humanity. And so, as the light from the hallway spilled across the threshold, and the figure of a small child appeared, the courtroom held its breath, ready for a story that no one would ever forget. The side door creaked open, and in the hush of the courtroom, even the smallest sound seemed magnified. A gentle rustle of fabric, the faint tap of small shoes against the polished floor. It was the entrance everyone had been waiting for. And yet it carried with it a vulnerability that tugged at every heart in the room. A bailiff stepped through first, his broad shoulders framing the space behind him. He wasn't there to intimidate, but to guide, to ensure the path ahead was clear. And behind him, clinging tightly to the hand of a guardian, came the tiniest witness the courthouse had ever seen. Lily. She was only 3 years old, though the weight of her small presence filled the room, as though she carried something much larger on her fragile shoulders. Her hair was tied into 2 uneven pigtails, one ribbon slipping slightly loose, a detail that made her look even younger than her years. She wore a simple pale yellow dress, wrinkled at the hem, with white socks that slouched inside her scuffed shoes. In her other hand, the one not clutching her guardian, she held onto a stuffed rabbit whose once fluffy ears had long since wilted from being hugged too often. The rabbit had no name that anyone in the courtroom knew, but it was clearly her anchor. Its faded fabric told the story of sleepless nights, of tears soaked into soft fur, of a child's need for something constant in a world too uncertain. Lily's eyes, wide and searching, swept across the sea of unfamiliar faces staring at her. They were large, brown eyes, filled with both innocence and fear, and they seemed to plead silently for comfort. For one fragile moment, she froze at the doorway, her tiny shoulders tightening as though she might turn and retreat. The guardian, an older woman with tired eyes and a calm but firm grip, gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "It's all right, sweetheart," the woman whispered softly, though her voice carried just enough for the silence of the room to hear. "You're not alone." Still, the courtroom loomed impossibly large. The tall benches, the stern faces, the black robes of the judge, it was a world built for adults, not for children who still measured their days in naps and snack times. Even the witness chair, waiting at the front of the room, looked enormous compared to her. Max noticed her immediately. From where he sat near the bench, the German shepherd's ears perked, and his steady gaze softened. He shifted slightly forward, not in impatience, but in recognition. It was as if he had been waiting for this very moment, for this very child. His handler, Officer Ramirez, felt the gentle pull on the leash and murmured, "Easy, boy." But Max was already calm, already certain. His job was not to intimidate, but to protect, and in his own silent way, he knew his most important duty was about to begin. The judge watched the scene unfold with care. His eyes, so often hardened by years of presiding over difficult cases, softened as he saw Lily cling to her guardian. He leaned forward slightly, lowering the height of his gaze so it would seem less imposing. In his decades on the bench, he had witnessed testimonies from hardened criminals, frightened victims, and seasoned experts, but never had he seen such small footsteps echo across the courtroom floor. The bailiff led Lily and her guardian toward the witness chair. The child's shoes tapped nervously, each step hesitant. At one point, she stumbled slightly, and a quiet gasp rippled across the audience, as though a room full of strangers wanted to leap forward to catch her. But she steadied herself, tightened her grip on the stuffed rabbit, and continued forward with a bravery that belonged only to children who didn't yet know the full meaning of fear. When she reached the chair, she looked up at it as though it were a mountain to climb. The bailiff gently lifted her, setting her carefully on the wide wooden seat. Her legs dangled far above the ground, swinging nervously in the open space. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to tuck her dress around her knees, glancing around at the adults towering over her. Her guardian gave her one last reassuring squeeze on the shoulder before stepping back, leaving Lily alone in the oversized chair. The child's knuckles whitened around the rabbit, holding it as though it were the last familiar thing in the world. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but no sound came. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and fragile. Lawyers exchanged cautious glances. Members of the audience held their breath, willing her to find her voice. The weight of expectation pressed down on her tiny frame. The judge, recognizing the fear, spoke gently. "Lily," he said, his tone warm and almost grandfatherly. "You're very brave to be here today. You don't have to be afraid. Do you see Max over there?" Lily's gaze followed the direction of his hand. Her eyes landed on Max, the police dog sitting calmly near the bench. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to fade away for her. The fear softened in her eyes as she studied the dog's calm expression, his ears attentive but relaxed, his tail resting still on the floor. Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, tiny, fleeting, but real. "That's Max," the judge continued gently. "He's here just for you. He's your friend, and he'll stay by your side. Do you think you'd like that?" Lily looked at the dog again, then back at the judge. Her small voice, barely more than a whisper, broke through the silence. "Yes." It was the first word she had spoken in the courtroom, and though it was small, it carried enormous weight. The audience let out the breath they had all been holding. Officer Ramirez gave a subtle hand signal, and Max stood gracefully, padding toward the witness chair. His nails clicked softly against the polished wood, each sound steady and measured. When he reached Lily, he sat beside the chair, tall enough that his head nearly reached her lap. Tentatively, Lily reached down, her small fingers brushing against his thick fur. Max didn't move suddenly or startle her. He simply tilted his head slightly, allowing her to stroke him. The stuffed rabbit loosened in her grip as her other hand found comfort in the living warmth of the dog. The room shifted again. The tension that had seemed unbearable only moments earlier began to soften, replaced by something else hope. From the prosecution's table, the attorney leaned forward, a flicker of relief crossing his face. From the defense's side, even the most skeptical lawyer seemed to pause, momentarily disarmed by the sight of a child, drawing courage from a dog's silent companionship. Lily straightened slightly in the chair. She wasn't ready to speak yet, not about the hard things, but she had taken the first step. And in a courtroom where truth was the most powerful currency, even that small step mattered. The judge gave a nod, his expression gentle. "Take your time, Lily. We're all listening when you're ready." She clutched the rabbit once more. But this time her other hand remained on Max. The steady rise and fall of his breathing, the warmth of his body, and the unspoken promise in his eyes told her she was safe. For the first time since she entered the room, her legs stopped swinging nervously. Instead, she sat quietly, courage beginning to grow inside her, planted like a seed by the calm presence of a loyal friend. And though no one in the courtroom said it aloud, everyone there knew the tiniest witness had just become the bravest. The air inside the courtroom was so thick with silence that even the faintest sound, an anxious cough, the squeak of a bench seemed magnified 100 times. Lily sat high on the oversized witness chair, her tiny body looking lost against the heavy wooden frame. Her little shoes dangled far above the floor, tapping nervously against the wood as if trying to keep rhythm with her racing heart. She held the stuffed rabbit tighter than ever, her gaze fixed downward, too frightened to meet the eyes of so many strangers. The room seemed to collectively lean forward. Lawyers on both sides were waiting, pens poised above notepads. The jury watched closely, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes betraying curiosity. The audience family, advocates, and community members sat hushed, their bodies taut with expectation. Everyone was waiting for her to speak, but the longer the silence stretched, the more unbearable it became. Judge Whitaker, seated above on his bench, felt the weight of it too. He had presided over cases involving hardened criminals, corporate scandals, and violent tragedies. He had dealt with seasoned witnesses who stood firm under cross-examination and others who crumbled. But never in his decades of service had he felt such a fragile, delicate moment. The child was frozen. Whitaker watched her small shoulders rise and fall quickly, watched her knuckles tighten around the rabbit until the faded fabric bunched between her fingers. It was painfully clear that the little girl, for all her bravery in walking into the room, was overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. The high ceilings, the watchful eyes, the stern faces, everything seemed to tower over her. She was 3 years old, asked to carry a truth bigger than herself. And so, the judge did something unusual. He leaned forward, resting his elbows gently on the polished wood of the bench. His gavel, normally the instrument of command, sat untouched at his side. Instead, he softened his voice until it was almost like a grandfather speaking to a grandchild, and he said, "Lily, do you see Max over there?" The child blinked, startled by the softness in his tone. Slowly, she lifted her eyes from her lap and followed the judge's gesture. Max sat only a few feet away, his body tall and steady, his expression calm. His ears twitched as her gaze landed on him, and his eyes, warm and steady, met hers. The dog didn't move suddenly or bark. He simply held her gaze as if saying, "I'm here. You're not alone." For the first time since she entered, Lily's lips curved into the smallest flicker of a smile. It was fleeting, like sunlight slipping through clouds, but it was there. The judge noticed and seized the moment. "Max is a very special friend," he said gently. "He comes to this courtroom only for the bravest children. He's here to sit with you, to make sure you feel safe. Would you like him to be closer?" A hush rippled across the room. Lawyers exchanged subtle glances, some surprised by the judge's directness. A few skeptical faces in the audience frowned, unsure if such a gesture was proper in a court of law. But no one dared object. They could see the trembling child, and in their hearts, they knew this was not about formality. It was about humanity. Lily nodded slowly. Her voice was barely audible when she whispered, "Yes." The sound was so soft that, for a moment, it seemed only Max heard it. His ears perked again, his body leaning slightly forward in anticipation. Officer Ramirez, his handler, gave a subtle hand signal and spoke quietly. "Max, go on." The dog rose with fluid grace, his paws clicking gently against the hardwood floor. Each step was deliberate, calm, and measured, as though he knew the gravity of the moment. The courtroom held its collective breath as he approached the witness stand. When he reached the chair, Max sat down beside Lily, his posture tall but relaxed, his head nearly level with her lap. He tilted his head slightly, offering her his presence without demand. At first, Lily only stared at him, her rabbit still clutched tightly in one hand. Then, hesitantly, she lowered her other hand to touch his fur. Her tiny fingers brushed through the thick coat, and something inside her seemed to shift. The rabbit remained in her lap, but her grip loosened for the first time since she had entered. The audience softened collectively, the tension bleeding out of shoulders and jaws. Lawyers who had moments before been sharpening their strategies against one another now sat back, their eyes drawn to the simple image of a child and a dog. The jury's expression softened too. One woman even dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Judge Whitaker gave a faint smile. His voice remained low and kind. "That's Max. He doesn't talk, but he listens better than anyone in this room. He's here for you, Lily. You don't have to be afraid when he's beside you." Lily's hand continued to stroke the dog's fur. She leaned forward slightly, as if whispering something only Max could hear. Though her words were too quiet for most to catch, her expression eased. Her breathing slowed, the quick rise and fall of panic settling into something steadier. The prosecutor, watching carefully, felt a swell of cautious relief. They had worried that Lily might not be able to say anything at all, that the trauma and fear would silence her. But the child's body language told them something different. Now she was beginning to feel safe. The defense attorney, though outwardly composed, shifted uneasily in his chair. He had no argument against the presence of a service dog legally. It was permitted. But he knew the impact was powerful. No jury in the world would fail to be moved by the sight of a toddler finding courage in the steady presence of a loyal dog. The judge leaned back slightly, giving Lily and Max their space. He gestured quietly to the bailiff, who dimmed the lights overhead just a fraction, softening the harshness of the room. Even the ceiling fans seemed to slow, their steady hum fading into the background. The environment itself shifted, transforming from a cold chamber of law into a place where trust could grow. Lily whispered again, her lips close to Max's ear. This time, her words carried just enough for those in the front rows to hear. "You'll protect me, right?" Max let out a low, soft whine, not loud, not disruptive, but enough to make her smile. She pressed her tiny hand against his neck, resting there as if anchoring herself. The stuffed rabbit slid slightly from her lap, no longer clutched in desperation, but resting loosely beside her. In that moment, the courtroom was no longer focused on legal procedure or courtroom decorum. It was focused on the raw humanity of a child's fear and the silent comfort of a dog who asked nothing in return. Judge Whitaker let the silence stretch again, but this time it was not heavy, it was reverent. Everyone seemed to recognize they were witnessing something profound. Finally, the judge spoke once more, his voice steady but kind. "Lily, you are very brave. Take your time. We're all listening when you're ready." The little girl nodded, her hand still resting on Max. She didn't speak yet, but she sat taller in the chair, no longer swallowed entirely by fear. The courtroom waited not with impatience, but with hope. And for the first time since the proceedings began, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. The tiniest witness might just find her voice after all. The stillness inside the courtroom was unlike anything anyone had ever felt. It wasn't the stiff, uncomfortable silence of legal proceedings, nor was it the fearful hush of an audience bracing for bad news. This silence was alive, fragile, tender, waiting for something delicate to break through. Lily sat in the towering witness chair, her stuffed rabbit now half forgotten in her lap. Her small hand still rested against Max's warm fur, the other gripping the wooden edge of the chair as if she might slip without it. Her breathing had slowed, but her wide eyes still flickered nervously from face to face before always returning to Max. The German shepherd sat poised, ears slightly tilted forward, his body still, but his presence unshakable. He was her anchor in this vast sea of adults, her silent promise of safety. She leaned closer to him, her little legs still dangling above the floor, swinging unconsciously. The judge, prosecutors, defense attorneys, jury, and every onlooker remained frozen, afraid that even the faintest interruption might shatter the fragile courage building in her chest. Then it happened. Lily bent forward, pressing her lips close to Max's ear, her voice meant only for him. "I'm scared," she whispered, her words quivering like fragile glass. "But I know you'll protect me, puppy." The words were so soft that, at first, it seemed only Max had heard them. His tail gave the slightest thump against the floor, a subtle reassurance. But the courtroom, holding its collective breath, had caught every syllable. The microphone set to amplify even the quietest sound for the record, had carried her tiny voice across the room, filling the silence with her unguarded confession. And just like that, the air shifted. The audience stirred, but not with noise, rather with emotion. A ripple of quiet gasps moved through the benches. A few parents dabbed quickly at their eyes. Hardened police officers shifted uncomfortably, their throats tight with something they weren't used to showing. Even the stenographer, who prided herself on objectivity, felt her hands tremble slightly against the keys as she typed the words into permanent record. The prosecution attorney swallowed hard, blinking rapidly before steadying himself. He had prepared countless arguments, rehearsed his questions carefully, strategized every point. Yet none of it compared to this. A 3-year-old had just spoken a sentence that pierced through layers of legal jargon and defenses, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. The defense attorney, meanwhile, stiffened. His pen tapped nervously against the table, his practiced mask slipping just slightly. He knew those words so simple, so unfiltered, would stick in the minds of every juror, every person in that room. You couldn't cross-examine innocence. You couldn't dismantle the unplanned honesty of a child. Judge Whitaker felt the lump in his throat too. He had presided over decades of trials, and he had learned to guard himself against sentiment. But at that moment, as he looked down at the child who clutched a rabbit in one hand and a dog's fur in the other, he felt the sting of tears prick behind his eyes. He adjusted his glasses, disguising the movement as routine, but inside he was shaken. And then Lily kept speaking. She wasn't addressing the lawyers, the jury, or the judge. She wasn't thinking about testimony or responsibility. She was speaking to Max, as if the two of them were the only souls in the room. "You're the only one who isn't scary," she murmured, her voice carrying just enough for the microphones again. "I can talk to you." Max leaned in slightly, pressing his muzzle closer to her hand. Lily giggled softly, the sound like a spark of light in the dim heaviness of the courtroom. The audience exhaled, as though that tiny giggle had given them all permission to breathe again. The judge leaned forward, his tone low and gentle. "That's all right, Lily. You can talk to Max, and when you do, we'll all listen carefully. He'll stay with you the whole time." The reassurance gave Lily courage. She looked around again, her gaze sweeping the faces of adults, lawyers with sharp suits, jurors with serious expressions, strangers she didn't know. Her lower lip trembled, but she clung tighter to Max. She didn't fully understand what was happening. But she knew one thing with the certainty only children possessed. If Max was beside her, she could be brave. The prosecution attorney rose slowly, his voice softer than he had ever used in a courtroom. "Lily, can you tell Max what happened? You don't have to look at me. You don't have to look at anyone else. Just tell Max." All eyes went back to the little girl. She hesitated, her fingers twisting in Max's fur, her gaze darting nervously. Then she leaned down again, her cheek brushing against Max's head as she spoke quietly. I saw the bad man." The words were barely above a whisper, but the courtroom caught them. The prosecutor nodded gently, signaling that it was enough for now. He didn't push, didn't press for details, just let the truth trickle out in its own time. The defense attorney shifted again, his jaw tightening. Every word the child spoke seemed to erode the wall he had worked so hard to build. He scribbled notes furiously, though his eyes betrayed the unease he felt. Meanwhile, the audience leaned forward, mesmerized. This wasn't just testimony. It was a window into the raw honesty of a child's world, a place where fear was met not with strategy or logic, but with the comfort of a loyal friend. Lily continued, her voice faltering but steady enough. "He was loud, and I didn't like it. But Max makes it quiet." Her words struck again. She wasn't describing in legal terms, but her truth was unmistakable. For her, safety wasn't about locks or police presence. It was about the calm heartbeat of a dog sitting by her side. Max remained perfectly still, his eyes locked on hers, his presence uncheckable. To him, this was instinct, training, loyalty all merging into one. But to everyone else, it was something much greater. The innocence of her confession, the purity of her trust, had transformed the courtroom. A few tears escaped down the faces of those seated in the gallery. A hardened detective wiped quickly at his cheek, pretending it was nothing. The stenographer typed diligently, though her eyes blurred. Even the judge cleared his throat twice before continuing, fighting to maintain composure. For Lily, none of that mattered. She hadn't intended to move a room of adults to tears. She hadn't thought about the impact of her words or the gravity of her presence. She was simply a little girl, afraid but trusting, finding her courage in a friend who couldn't speak, but whose silence said everything she needed. As her confession hung in the air, unchallenged and unforgettable, the courtroom knew something had shifted forever. The tiniest voice had spoken the loudest truth. And with that, the trial was no longer just about evidence, arguments, or technicalities. It was about the undeniable humanity of a child's fear and the extraordinary comfort of a dog, who gave her strength to say what no one else could. For a long moment, the courtroom remained suspended in a silence so fragile, it seemed as if a single breath could shatter it. Lily's words still echoed in the air, soft but unforgettable. "I'm scared, but I know you'll protect me." Puppy. They had been meant only for Max. But because of the microphones and the stillness of the room, every single person had heard them. The words lingered in the minds of all who sat there, weaving themselves into something bigger than testimony. They were not just the words of a child, They were a reflection of trust, innocence, and the desperate need for safety that adults so often forgot. At first, no one moved. The attorneys froze in their places, pens hovering above their notepads. Jurors sat transfixed, their carefully practiced neutrality faltering as raw emotion softened their expressions. The gallery, filled with family members and community supporters, stared with wet eyes, unable to look away from the fragile scene at the front of the room. Then slowly, like ripples spreading across a pond after a stone has been dropped, the emotions began to show. A mother in the gallery pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely. She had come expecting a battle of legal words, but what she witnessed was something far greater. The voice of a child too young to understand strategy, but old enough to understand fear. Beside her, an older man who had lost faith in the justice system wiped his eyes discreetly, ashamed of the tears, but unable to hold them back. One of the detectives in uniform shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening as he looked down at his lap. He had spent years interviewing victims, hearing testimonies, and recording statements. He had thought he was hardened, immune to displays of emotion. Yet here he was, blinking back moisture in his eyes because of a child who didn't even know she was testifying. Even the stenographer, whose fingers danced methodically across the keys, paused for the briefest of seconds. She knew she wasn't supposed to react, but her vision blurred with tears, she quickly wiped away before continuing. At the prosecution's table, Attorney Martin found himself tightening his grip on his pen until it left an indentation on his skin. He had fought countless cases, built arguments on mountains of evidence, and crafted speeches designed to sway juries. But as he looked at Lily stroking Max's fur, he realized no crafted speech could ever hold the power of her unguarded words. She had spoken from a place no attorney could manufacture, the raw, unfiltered heart of a child. On the defense's side, Attorney Green shifted in his chair, the calm mask he wore cracking ever so slightly. He knew how dangerous this moment was for his case. Facts could be debated, evidence could be challenged, witnesses could be discredited. But what could anyone say against the honesty of a 3-year-old's whispered confession to a dog? Green tapped his pen against his notepad, frustration building. He reminded himself that juries were supposed to judge on evidence, not emotion. Yet, watching the jurors now, he could see how impossible that would be. The ripple had reached them too. Judge Whitaker felt it most of all. His role demanded impartiality, a careful distance from the emotions that flowed through his courtroom. But in his decades of service, he had never been immune to the moments that reminded him of the human stakes behind the law. And this was one of those moments. He watched the toddler clutch her rabbit in one hand and Max's fur in the other, her face still pale with fear, but softened by trust. His heart ached in a way he hadn't felt in years. The law was supposed to be about order and evidence, but it was also supposed to be about justice. And justice, he realized, was never just about facts, it was about people. Max himself remained calm and steady. He didn't understand laws, trials, or justice. But he understood Lily. Her voice, trembling but brave, reached him in a way that required no translation. His tail gave a slow, steady thump against the floor. He leaned his head closer to her hand, nuzzling gently as if to answer, "I'm here, always." The ripple spread further, touching even those who tried to resist it. A juror in the back row, a man known for his stoicism, felt his throat tighten. Another juror, a young woman, blinked quickly and dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She had promised herself she would remain impartial, but in that moment, she saw not a case, but a child who reminded her of her own niece at home. The bailiff, usually a figure of stone, cleared his throat and looked away, focusing intently on a spot on the far wall. He would never admit to anyone that the words had struck him deeply, but his hand clenched tightly at his side. It wasn't just that Lily had spoken. It was what her words represented, the undeniable vulnerability of children, the courage it took for them to step into adult spaces, and the profound impact of simple trust. In a world full of complexity, her sentence had been painfully simple, and that was exactly why it resonated so strongly. For a few moments, the trial itself seemed forgotten. It wasn't about the legal strategies, the objections, or the rules of procedure. It was about a child, a stuffed rabbit, and a loyal dog. It was about the purity of innocence, and the reminder that, at the heart of justice, there were always people, fragile, flawed, hopeful people. Judge Whitaker finally broke the silence, his voice steadier than he felt inside. "Thank you, Lily," he said softly. "That was very brave." She didn't look at him. Instead, she leaned closer to Max again, whispering something only he could hear. But the way her shoulders relaxed told the room what they needed to know. She felt safe. The prosecution attorney stood slowly, choosing his words with care. He didn't want to break the delicate balance of the moment. "Lily," he said gently, "would you like to tell Max what you saw that day? You don't have to tell us, just him. We'll listen while you talk to him." Lily looked at Max again, her small fingers tightening in his fur. She nodded, her lips trembling. Then, with a bravery that stunned the room, she began to speak in halting, childlike sentences, her voice directed only to Max. As she spoke, the ripple spread into something more powerful. It was no longer just an emotional response. It was a collective awakening. Everyone present, from the most hardened officer to the most skeptical attorney, understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. It wasn't just testimony. It was truth, spoken in the purest way possible. And it had changed the room forever. The hush in the courtroom held steady, but the energy inside had shifted. Where before there had been stiff formality, now there was something softer, fragile, almost sacred. All eyes remained fixed on the small figure in the witness chair, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest, her other hand buried deep in the warm fur of the police dog beside her. Lily had whispered her fears, confessed her trust, and unknowingly changed the atmosphere of the entire trial. Yet as those words faded, she hesitated again. Her little body stiffened, her eyes darting nervously around the room, searching for reassurance. That was when Max moved. It wasn't much, just a small, deliberate gesture, but it carried weight that went far beyond its simplicity. The German shepherd shifted his body slightly closer to her, pressing his side against the wooden base of the chair. His great head lowered, nuzzling gently into the palm of her hand. His ears flicked back, not in fear, but in a gesture of calm submission, as if to say, "You lead, little one. I will follow." Lily let out a tiny gasp, almost a giggle, and her shoulders relaxed. She leaned into him instinctively, as though she'd been waiting for that very touch. Her fingers curled deeper into his fur, her cheek brushing against the top of his head. The gesture was so simple, but the courtroom felt it like a thunderclap. The jury, who had been struggling to remain impartial, leaned in unconsciously. The ripple from before surged again, this time with even more force. This wasn't just a child speaking her truth, it was an animal, responding in the only way he could, giving her strength when human words had failed. The judge adjusted his glasses again, his lips pressing together. He told himself he needed to maintain control of the room, but in his heart, he knew there was no need. No one dared interrupt. No one wanted to. This was not distraction. This was testimony of a different kind, one that bypassed formality and touched something primal inside them all. Attorney Martin, representing the prosecution, felt a pang of gratitude he couldn't fully explain. He had asked Lily to tell Max what had happened, but he hadn't expected this, the dog taking up his role as protector and silent witness. Max had become the bridge between fear and truth. Attorney Green, on the defense side, clenched his pen tightly enough to crack the cap. His strategy was unraveling before his eyes. Every time the child faltered, the dog gave her strength, and each moment carved deeper into the jury's hearts. Green knew the law, but he also knew people. And people, once moved by something so pure, were nearly impossible to sway back. For the rest of the courtroom, the parents, the officers, the families, the moment carried something even more personal. It was as if Max represented what they all wished they could do: step forward, wrap the child in safety, and tell her she wasn't alone. Yet they couldn't. Only Max could. And he did. Lily, unaware of the waves her words and Max's gesture had caused, tilted her head toward the dog and whispered again, this time with a hint of a smile. "See? You're listening." Max's brown eyes, steady and unblinking, met hers. The room seemed to hold its breath. Though he could not speak, his response was clear in every fiber of his body. He stayed still, calm, present. To Lily, that silence said everything. "I'm here. I'm not leaving." Her tiny shoulders rose and fell as she took a shaky breath. The tension in her face eased, replaced with something new: courage. She sat up straighter, her little legs still swinging, but less frantic now. She glanced around, then back at Max, as though drawing from a well of strength he had opened inside her. When she spoke again, her voice was louder, steadier. The bad man was there. A ripple of sound swept the room, a collective intake of breath. Her words, though childlike, landed with the weight of truth. Max thumped his tail once against the floor, so quietly it might have gone unnoticed if not for the stillness in the room. Lily smiled faintly at the sound, encouraged. "You heard me, right? You know I'm not lying." Her gaze stayed fixed on Max, but everyone else felt the impact. A little girl had found her voice, and she had done so because a dog had promised her, without a single word, that she was safe. The prosecution attorney leaned forward slightly, careful not to intrude. "That's very good, Lily. You're very brave. You can keep talking to Max, if you want. We'll just listen." Lily nodded, her grip on Max's fur tightening again. She whispered to him, the microphones catching every word. He was loud. "I didn't like his eyes. But you're here now, so it's okay." Max shifted his weight, pressing closer still, his body forming a barrier between her and the rest of the room. It wasn't aggression. It was loyalty, instinct. He understood that her fear was real, and he responded in the way only he could, by making himself her shield. The jury couldn't ignore it. They leaned forward, their pens forgotten, their eyes locked on the small child and her silent guardian. No cross-examination, no argument could undo what they were witnessing, the undeniable truth of a bond built on trust. The audience felt it too. A woman in the back wiped her eyes openly, no longer caring who saw. A man beside her swallowed hard, his hands clenched together. Even the bailiff, usually so stoic, shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking toward the ceiling to steady himself. The defense attorney finally rose, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, I must object to the theatrics of this situation. The witness is clearly being influenced by..." But Judge Whitaker cut him off, his tone calm but firm. "Overruled. The child is testifying in her own way. The presence of the service animal is authorized by this court. Proceed." The defense attorney sat back down, his jaw tight, his frustration visible. But inside, he knew the battle was slipping from his grasp. Logic could argue, evidence could be disputed, but no one could challenge what they had all just seen. A child speaking her truth, and a dog giving her the courage to do it. Lily, oblivious to the legal maneuvers around her, continued. "You make me brave, Max. If I tell you everything, will you still stay?" Max tilted his head, his steady eyes fixed on hers. His silence was louder than words, and she smiled, a small trembling smile that broke the last remnants of tension. "Yes," she whispered to herself, answering her own question. "You'll stay." And with that, she continued her testimony, no longer trembling, no longer lost. She spoke in fragments, in childlike sentences, but each one carried weight. Each one brought clarity. And each one was delivered with a confidence that only existed because a loyal dog had silently replied, "I will never leave you." By the time she paused, the courtroom was no longer the same. Something invisible had shifted, something unshakable. The ripple that had begun with her first whispered words had now become a wave one that no argument could ever wash away. The air inside the courtroom was thick, heavy with the kind of silence that demanded respect. The moments leading up to this point had already left a mark on everyone present. Lily's trembling whispers, Max's steady comfort, the ripple of emotion spreading through the room. But now, something greater was happening. For the first time since the trial had begun, Lily wasn't just clinging to Max. She was leaning on him, drawing from him. Her tiny fingers tangled in his thick fur, as if she had tapped into an endless reservoir of strength. Her wide eyes still darted nervously across the room from time to time, but each time fear threatened to rise, Max was there. One nuzzle, one steady gaze, one silent promise. And each time she grew braver. The prosecutor, Martin, recognized the delicate balance before him. He had learned long ago that children could not be pushed. They bloomed only when allowed to do so in their own time. So he spoke softly, carefully, as though speaking to both Lily and Max at once. "Lily," he said, his tone gentle but clear enough for the record, "you can just keep talking to Max, if you'd like. Pretend no one else is here. We're only listening." Lily blinked, her tiny shoulders trembling as if she wasn't sure she believed him. But then she looked at Max, who sat pressed firmly against her chair, his great body forming a shield. She took in a shaky breath, then whispered into his ear, though her words carried across the microphone. "The bad man was there." He yelled. I didn't like it. The courtroom seemed to inhale all at once. The jurors leaned in without meaning to. The audience sat straighter. Even the bailiff's rigid stance softened. Everyone knew the gravity of those words. Encouraged, Lily continued, speaking haltingly, as though each word cost her courage to pull out. "He was loud. He scared Mommy. He made me cry. But Max makes it quiet." Her voice cracked, but Max's steady presence kept her from collapsing back into silence. He pressed his muzzle into her palm, and she smiled faintly through her tears. The judge adjusted his glasses again, nodding slightly to himself. It wasn't a formal gesture, but one of quiet respect for the child, for the dog, for the honesty of the moment. Attorney Green, the defense lawyer, scribbled furiously on his notepad, but his face betrayed him. He knew every word the child spoke was searing itself into the minds of the jury. Evidence could be debated, but this was pure, unfiltered truth from a voice too innocent to be manipulated. Martin, careful not to break the fragile thread of courage, asked again, softly, "Can you tell Max what the bad man looked like?" Lily frowned, her small brow furrowing in concentration. She rubbed Max's ear, her comfort anchor. He was big. He had a hat. He was angry. His eyes were mean. She paused, shivering, but then added with surprising firmness, "I don't like his eyes." The words landed like a stone thrown into the still pond of the courtroom. Simple, childlike, yet more damning than any detailed testimony. The jury shifted uncomfortably, each of them envisioning the bad man through her frightened eyes. Max's tail gave a single thump against the floor. The sound made Lily smile, her nerves easing again. She leaned forward, whispering almost conspiratorially, "See? Max knows." He knows I'm telling the truth." The audience melted. Tears flowed freely now. Tissues rustled. Even the stern detective, who had vowed to remain composed, rubbed his eyes discreetly. But it wasn't just emotion. It was the authenticity behind every word. The jury wasn't watching a child repeat rehearsed lines. They were witnessing the raw bravery of a toddler who had every reason to stay silent, yet found her voice because of a dog. Encouraged, Lily went on. "I was scared. Mommy cried. But Max makes it better. Max makes the scary go away." Her words, fragile yet steady, struck deeper than any adult testimony ever could. The courtroom wasn't just hearing about a crime anymore. They were feeling the fear of a child, reliving it through her tiny, trembling sentences. Martin didn't press further. He knew enough had been said, more than enough to let the jury feel the truth. Instead, he nodded gently and said, "That was very brave, Lily. Thank you for telling Max." Lily tilted her head, her pigtails brushing her cheeks, and whispered to Max again, "Did I do good?" Max shifted closer, his tail brushing once more against the floor. Lily giggled through her tears, her little voice rising. He said yes. The room broke. Quiet chuckles mixed with sobs, the tension easing just enough for humanity to seep back in. Even the judge allowed himself a faint smile before regaining his composure. To anyone else, Max's silence was just that silence. But to Lily, it was a conversation. She believed with her whole heart that the dog understood her, that his nudges and tail thumps were his way of answering back. And in that belief, she found power. Her testimony continued in fragments, descriptions of the night, snippets of fear, the comfort she felt now. Each piece was small, but together they formed a picture more powerful than any photograph or police report. A child's view of the truth. By the time she finished, the courtroom was transformed. The jury sat with pens idle, their notes forgotten, their faces softened. The defense attorney looked weary, as though he knew no strategy could undo what had just happened. The prosecution sat quietly triumphant, though even Martin understood this wasn't about winning, it was about justice finally finding its voice. Judge Whitaker leaned forward, his voice steady, though his eyes glistened faintly. "Lily," he said, "you have been very brave today. You helped us more than you know." She nodded shyly, turning to Max. "We did it, right?" Max's eyes remained locked on hers, calm and steady. His silence was once again his loudest answer. And the courtroom knew they had just witnessed courage in its purest form. Not the courage of lawyers, or officers, or judges, but the courage of a child, held up by the silent, unwavering loyalty of a dog. For Lily, it wasn't about evidence, or trials, or verdicts. It was simple. She had been scared, and she had found courage. And in that courage, she gave the courtroom something they would never forget. The courage of innocence. The courtroom had seen its share of trials, murders, robberies, betrayals of every kind. Its walls had absorbed decades of arguments, objections, verdicts, and tears. But never before had it felt like this. When Lily's testimony ended, the silence lingered as though the room itself didn't want to disturb what had just happened. The gavel did not strike, the attorneys did not shuffle their papers, and even the jury seemed unwilling to move. They all remained seated, their eyes fixed on the little girl who sat beside Max, as though the world outside those walls did not exist. Lily leaned forward, her cheek resting against Max's fur, her stuffed rabbit clutched loosely in her hand. She whispered, so softly it might have gone unheard if not for the microphone, "Thank you, puppy." And with those words, the courtroom broke. It wasn't chaos, not in the loud sense. It was emotion spilling over in waves. Some people cried openly, no longer trying to hide their tears. A mother in the back held her child closer, while the stern detective covered his mouth with his hand to mask the sob that had escaped him. Jurors shifted uncomfortably, torn between their duty to remain impartial and the undeniable humanity of what they had just experienced. Judge Whitaker, who had spent decades tempering his reactions, felt his throat tighten. He leaned back slightly, pretending to adjust his robes, but in truth, he needed a moment to steady himself. He had seen hardened criminals confess without emotion, lawyers argue with venom, victims break down in pain. Yet here was a child, barely 3 years old, who had spoken words that reached deeper than any argument, any confession, any evidence ever could. The prosecution attorney, Martin, sat frozen. He wanted to stand, to declare victory, to move the trial forward. But he knew better. This wasn't about winning. This was about something far greater, a child's bravery, a dog's loyalty, and the truth that had poured out between them. He placed his pen down gently, his eyes glassy, his thoughts racing. Across the aisle, the defense attorney Green slumped in his chair. His mask had slipped entirely now. He knew the case had shifted beyond legal maneuvering. Logic, technicalities, loopholes, all of them paled in the shadow of what the jury had just witnessed. He rubbed his temples, his face pale, realizing that no argument could erase the image of a little girl whispering her, thanks to a police dog in open court. The ripple that had begun earlier in the day was now a tidal wave. It wasn't just about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about humanity. About justice seen not through the sharp eyes of the law, but through the wide, innocent eyes of a child who only wanted to feel safe. Lily shifted in her seat, patting Max's head. "We did good," she whispered again, her small voice carrying farther than she intended. A few soft chuckles broke through the tears in the gallery. Even the jury allowed themselves the faintest smiles. Max, steady and calm as ever, leaned into her touch. His body remained pressed against her chair, his presence unshakable. He didn't know the trial's stakes or the significance of the testimony. All he knew was that a small human beside him needed him, and that was enough. Judge Whitaker finally cleared his throat, his voice steadier than he felt. "The witness may step down." The bailiff, usually stoic and distant, approached with unusual gentleness. He extended a hand to help Lily climb down from the tall chair, but she shook her head. She placed both hands on Max instead. "He'll help me," she said firmly. The courtroom watched as Max rose to his feet, guiding Lily carefully down. She clung to his fur, her little legs wobbling slightly until she stood safely on the floor. The gallery exhaled in unison, as though the sight of her standing strong beside him had lifted a collective weight. Her mother rushed forward, kneeling to scoop Lily into her arms, but the child reached back, wrapping her arms around Max's neck in one last hug. "Bye-bye, puppy," she whispered. Then, after a pause, she corrected herself. "No, not bye. See you soon." The audience melted again. The words carried innocence, but also something deeper. Everyone knew that what they had just witnessed would remain with them forever. The judge, breaking his usual habit, allowed himself to speak beyond the confines of formality. "Let the record show," he said softly, "that this child's testimony was given with remarkable courage. And let it also be noted that the service animal has served with distinction. It wasn't standard language. It didn't need to be. It was humanity etched into the transcript of law." The jury, some wiping tears, some struggling to compose themselves, understood the weight of the moment. They weren't just deciding on evidence. They were carrying the memory of a child's bravery into their deliberations. As Lily left the stand, still clutching her rabbit and walking hand in hand with her mother, Max padded beside them until the bailiff gently signaled him back. He obeyed, but his eyes followed Lily until she disappeared through the side door. The silence that followed was unlike any other silence in the court's history. It wasn't heavy with fear or tension. It was reverent, sacred. Everyone present knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. For the jurors, it was a reminder that justice wasn't just about facts and laws. It was about people, about protecting the innocent, about giving voice to those who were too small to speak for themselves. For the officers, it was a reminder of why they had chosen their duty. For the families, it was hope that innocence could still shine through even the darkest of trials. And for Judge Whitaker, who had thought himself immune to moments like this, it was proof that the law, at its best, was not cold or mechanical. It was alive, beating in the hearts of those it served. The trial would continue. Evidence would be presented, arguments would be made, verdicts would be reached. But none of it would erase the memory of that little girl on the witness stand, whispering her fears and her thanks to a dog who listened without judgment. Long after the gavel fell, long after the jury returned with their decision, long after the trial was closed and the courthouse emptied, people would still speak of that day. They would remember the way the room fell silent, the way tears fell unashamed, the way a police dog gave courage to a child. And they would remember her words. Thank you, puppy. Simple, innocent, eternal. In the years to come, whenever someone who had been there recalled that day, they would struggle to explain the depth of it. They would talk about the child's bravery, the dog's loyalty, the way the courtroom itself seemed to transform. But always, always, they would end with those words. What a toddler said to a police dog in court had left everyone in tears, not just because of the sadness of her story, but because of the reminder it carried. That even in a place built for law and justice, sometimes it was innocence, trust, and love that spoke the loudest. And that memory, whispered into the ear of a loyal dog, would last forever.